China's rollout of restrictions last year on gallium, germanium, graphite, rare earth separation technology shows that they can really weaponize it and that they're willing. We don't really buy the narrative that this is the end of restrictions. We're probably going to see a steady stream.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast, a production of Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm your host, Adam Dixon. Today, I'm joined by Gracelin Baskaran, Director of the Project on Critical Mineral Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Dr. Baskaran is a mining economist with expertise in critical minerals, trade, and emerging markets. Prior to joining CSIS, she spent 7 years in South Africa, working on the platinum group metals sector and later joining the World Bank. Dr. Baskaran is in the midst of writing a book on an international strategy for critical minerals engagement for the United States. We are lucky to have Gracelin here before she embarks on a multi-country trip to conduct fieldwork for this book. Gracelin, welcome to New Enlightenment.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to kick off. You're a mining economist. You work for a geopolitically focused think tank. You have a new program on critical minerals. You're going to write a book. You know, we've moved from, as Daniel Jurgen said, from big oil to big shovel. So you're right in the midst of kind of a massive, important change in geopolitics and energy. The energy transition is reliant on minerals, so you're in the thick of it, but most people, when you talk to them about mining and critical minerals, either they then kind of fall asleep because mining sounds boring and just moving a bunch of rocks around. But what is the geology of it? Because when you hear about critical minerals, often in the media, you hear China. China produces this, they mine for it, they process it, and we're completely dependent on China, such that some people have the impression that these critical minerals and some of these rare earths in particular are only found in China. Is that true?
Adam, this is a great question. You're right. The rhetoric often says that resources are underground in China. However, this simply isn't true. Minerals have been a mainstay of their foreign policy for decades, and they have strategically procured from around the world, particularly in emerging economies in Africa. When looking at the 6 commodities that we talk about the most, so that's going to be nickel, cobalt, copper, graphite, rare earths, and lithium, China's actually only a top 3 producer for 2 of those commodities, which would be graphite and rare earths. However, they are a top 3 processor for all 6, and this could be anything from 20 to almost 95%, which means a lot of the resources that it processes are being extracted elsewhere and then exported. But the US also doesn't necessarily have all of these resources. We have less than 1% of the world's graphite, nickel, and cobalt, and we actually only have 1.3% of the world's rare earths. So a senator once asked me why we don't mine what we have underground first. And I told him we could only mine what God put under our feet, which would let us construct less than half an electric vehicle battery. So as the US, we have significant potential to build relationships with resource-rich countries because their commodities are not all based in China. And when I think about it, I mean, Africa is home to over 85% of the world's manganese, 80% of the world's platinum, 70% of the world's chrome, half the world's cobalt, a fifth of the world's graphite, and over 50 deposits of high-grade rare earth deposits. South America, 60% of the world's lithium exists in a lithium triangle of Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. 40% of the world's copper, and then a fifth of graphite, nickel, and rare earth elements. So it's an opportunity for the US to forge new relationships because we're starting to build more processing facilities, but we need to, as I like to call it, feed the machine, and that's going to require getting resources from new countries.
Right. So, but I'm just curious though on the reserves for rare earths in particular, but other critical minerals. Because when I've looked at the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey reports, I find them to not be very revealing. And I wonder, is it for, how confident are we that we know the reserve potential of many of these minerals? And just by analogy, I'm thinking of, 20 or 30 years ago, there was talk of peak oil that, we weren't going to access this. And then now, fast forward with new fracking technology, we realize, actually, we have abundant oil and gas in many places. I mean, the United States is an exporter now. And so I'm wondering, going back to your story about you telling the senator, is like, we don't have these resources. I mean, how confident are we that that's true? And I'm not saying that it's not true. Whereas other places we know because prospecting has been done in a more serious way, whereas maybe it's not done in other particular geographies. What do you think of that?
That's exactly right. So here is the easiest way I would put it is you need to map resources and then you need to explore. And exploration is actually a really challenging industry because 95% plus of exploration will never yield a mine. However, oxygen, exploration is really the oxygen of the mining sector. If you don't look, you will not find. If you don't find, you will not produce. Now, if we start to think about the US, we are doing more and more exploration, and we have we run up against a challenge of a lot of these resources sitting on indigenous land, which tend to be less explored. But when I look abroad at countries in Latin America, but particularly Africa, many of these countries are hardly mapped. They're either undermapped or they're relying on decades old mapping. And so it actually makes exploration a little bit more risky in that regard. Africa has the second lowest amount of exploration in the world. But what's fascinating is when we explore, we find. So if you look at, from 1980 to 2020, the amount of copper, cobalt, manganese that's been found is, even though we're extracting, 70% of the world's cobalt comes out of the DRC, the actual reserves of these commodities while extracting have been going up by 30 to 40%, even with limited exploration. So as we use more, do more mapping and do exploration, we're going to see these reserve figures grow. And I guess the example that I would use is lithium. Right now, Africa has about 4% of the world's lithium, but it's actually expected to triple in the next 4 years because we are doing more searching. So it's both a challenge domestically and abroad. Domestically, the US has fast-tracked an exploration and feasibility project in Alaska for graphite and chipped in $37.5 million that we didn't know existed 3 or 4 years ago. So it is something around the world that we're focusing on, is looking to find and finding to produce.
Okay, so so basically what you're saying is that the likelihood of these rare earths and other critical minerals is having in more abundance actually than we expect. Based on what we know of Latin America and Africa, and you would assume that in North America, as the incentives are put in, that we'll likely find even more reserves than we know of already in the United States and places like Canada.
Yeah, the biggest challenge we have in the United States is it's been years since that we've permitted a mine. And a lot of that sits in that friction between mining companies and indigenous communities. And so one of the challenges is actually just exploring on those lands, because we need to be very, aware that this is someone else's land. These are indigenous groups that have historically had their rights trampled on. So finding a way to ensure that they are benefiting is really key if we want to explore that land.
Right. And so the other issue around mining and the processing in particular of critical minerals is the environmental footprint and the effects on that. And my understanding of why China took the lead, or one of the reasons I should say that China took the lead in the processing of minerals, and in particular some of these rare earth minerals, is because the processing of it is pretty nasty, that's pretty dirty. And because environmental regulations are fairly lax, it was much easier to close down the processing facilities that existed in the United States, for example, and just ship it all off to China. Like with much of manufacturing we sent off all the polluting processes to places like China. I'm curious in terms of how true is that of the why China is so dominant as a processor, not necessarily as the miner, but as a processor? Is it partly because of the lax regulation? And thinking about the future, because if we're going to electrify so much of daily life and have more batteries and the processing capability we require with servers, and we need these minerals. I'm curious how clean or what is the state of the technology in terms of its environmental footprint for processing? Is it getting cleaner? And is mining becoming cleaner, or can it become cleaner? Right. So what we do to knowing that we're going to dig up the Earth's crust? What can we do to minimize the impact of that?
So when I was younger, we were completely comfortable with goods that were made in China. So part of it is we kind of ceded a certain comparative advantage. The US government opened a Bureau of Mines to coordinate mine production, processing, R&D in 1910. And we closed it in 1996. And we've now gone 28 years without that. And we were fine. We were like, hey, China has a comparative advantage, and that's not problematic. Until we started to realize, probably around 2010, that these resources could be very easily weaponized when they put in restrictions with Japan on rare earth exports owing to a fishing trawler dispute. Fast forward a couple of years, and we realized we were actually very precarious. But you're absolutely right. Production and processing capacity, certainly have significant environmental externalities. And one of the reasons that permitting is slow in the United States is because of those environmental challenges and consequences for the surrounding communities that we talked about. Now, the US and its allies, when we go to emerging markets, we are bidding against Chinese companies, and it may be cheaper for them to do business. The comparative advantage of the US and its allies is actually to show up to these countries and say, you know what, we have a more mutually beneficial model of mining with fewer negative externalities. But to do this, the responsible mining practices on the environmental front actually have to be spearheaded by us, because there is a lack of standards in many of these developing countries. This is where institutions such as the International Council of Minerals and Metals, which is one of your primary industry associations, has an important role to play in gaining consensus from mining and processing companies on how to do this. And just a quick, story is we've seen examples of what happens without this. So in October 2020, residents in Kabwe in Zambia brought a class action lawsuit against Anglo American on behalf of 100,000 children and women who have suffered significant health consequences due to lead exposure from local extraction. Kabwe is objectively one of the most polluted parts of the world, and medical studies have shown, this is mining that happened 50, 60 years ago, but medical studies have shown that residents continue, like if you were born today, have significantly high lead levels, which causes cognitive damage and organ failure. So if you were born today, you may have the cognitive development of a 9-year-old when you're 30. That's how bad it is. Similarly, decades of uranium mining in Niger has generated 20 million tons of radioactive tailings that have contaminated groundwater for 100,000 people that rely on drinking it. And this waste will be radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. And now we have much better practices to seal off those tailings. But ultimately, Zambia and Niger are both examples where mining companies needed to adopt stronger environmental, pro-human practices from the start of project development. The crisis in Niger could have been completely avoided if they had secured those tailings. So what we see is that we as the US and our allies need to do better to ensure that those externalities are managed, because it can't just be like we call it NIMBY. It can't just be the not in my backyard. I want to go dump my ESG somewhere else. Is we have an obligation to do better. If and ultimately that's the heart of creating a more mutually beneficial model of mining for global South countries.
And I'm curious, isn't China also doing that? Or, I mean, just saying that because, if you look at the strides that China is making in terms of its own environment and cleaning up its own environment and also pushing some of its state-owned companies to be more environmentally friendly. I mean, do we have, can we claim to be ahead of the curve? We as in
we
the
can
United
claim to be
States.
slower than China. Like
Yeah,
we do a lot of due diligence. We
right.
do a lot of environmental impact assessments. One of the challenges that the Development Finance Corporation has, which is our US government financing arm, is they kind of move slow, but they do a lot more due diligence to make sure we have responsible mining. I don't buy the narrative that China is really doing better. Indonesia, the nickel extraction in
Yeah,
Indonesia is like one of the most environmentally degrading in the world, and
yeah,
that's going to continue to be for thousands of years to come.
yeah,
The standards that Chinese companies are following on labor, human, environmental rights are very, very minimal. And even the standards that are, we have plenty of instances from international journalists, from policymakers in these countries to say their practices are very poor. So when we look at nickel, which is a great example, I was with the London Metals Exchange in London a couple of weeks ago. Is they're looking at should we be having a dual pricing structure, like essentially a green premium, because China's doing it in such an environmentally degrading way that quite a few Western companies don't even want to buy it. Like they don't want that offtake. So what we're looking at now is, are these companies willing to pay a premium for responsibly sourced nickel? And that's something that will be determined, I think, in months to come. But no, I don't think China has practices in place
right.
at this point. In fact, in some ways, they're getting worse.
Yeah, so just if listeners are wondering, I mean, what's happening in Indonesia, they're effectively cutting down rainforest to access these nickel deposits, and they're doing some of the processing there that's leading to the tailings where effectively, you won't have regrowth of the forests. Is that the extent of the environmental damage?
I mean, there's a lot of biodiversity damage.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this is happening on islands. So you're damaging the water, you're damaging the ground and essentially splitting it open. So I mean, and when you damage water, land, forests, I mean, it's very hard to come back from that. And there's no real rehabilitation measures. Whereas with Western companies, at the time that you open a mine, you need to have a mine closure plan about how you're going to manage that long term. So every part of biodiversity in Indonesia is being destroyed right now.
Right. And what about the processing of the minerals after they've come out of the ground and gone to the factories in China to process them? I mean, how dirty is that still? So the initial processing at the mine, but then the further processing, what's the state of that?
Yeah, it's not environmentally friendly. And look, it's challenging. We have a group of Chinese colleagues who said, you know what, you guys don't even want to process it because you don't want the environmental
Yes.
footprint. And that's not incorrect, right? Our hesitancy and again, like Chinese citizens do not want their water polluted, do not want, toxic air, but that's just the way it is right now. And so when we're looking, one of the questions I'm often asked is like rare earths, super important, national, economic, energy security, but separation is extremely environmentally damaging. Is what does it take to reduce that environmental, damage? And this is where I think the U.S. has a real comparative advantage. Is we have fantastic research and development. We have academic institutions that lead the way. And so we need to leverage these institutions along with our national laboratories to find out how to reduce the footprint of these. And I think we're making big strides, but we have many, many miles to go on that front.
All right. So it has implications for thinking about the sustainability of things like battery electric vehicles, right, which are claimed to be more environmentally friendly. But if they're dependent on critical minerals, and the processing of those critical minerals is still a problem, then their environmental footprint, notwithstanding their reduction of carbon, is actually something that is probably not considered sufficiently in the production of many of these technologies we require or are supposed to be part of an energy transition to using more electric. And perhaps we can come back to that later on the implications of mining for the energy transition and what we're missing. But I'd like to move from this geological and technical mining conversation now to the geopolitical and have a sense of, China has blocked exports of certain of these critical minerals. Critical minerals now are on the agenda for every Western country, the United States included. It's being taken seriously, and I want to understand what is at stake for the quote unquote West. And when I include West, Western, I take that as shorthand for liberal democracies, including the likes of South Korea and Japan and other countries that we are allied with. And what is at stake then for the West, if you like, from a security perspective, but also from an economic standpoint?
Great question, Adam. So minerals are the bedrock for national economic and energy security. And there's no way around it. I need it for almost every defense application: satellites, lasers, tanks, ICT technology. I need it for energy needs. If I look at an electric vehicle, for example, it weighs about 220 kilograms. 66 kilograms of that are graphite that China completely cut us off of. And we have less than 1% of the world's graphite. When I think about economic security, it's twofold. It's in my electronics that, make us our economy work, like computers, phones, data centers. But it's also ultimately that if we can't meet our needs, our economic growth slows down. So this is why we really care. And China's rollout of restrictions last year on gallium, germanium, graphite, rare earth separation technology shows that they can really weaponize it and that they're willing. We don't really buy the narrative that this is the end of restrictions. We're probably going to see a steady stream. I mean, those came out in 6 months. Mm-hmm. So the West, it cannot meet its mineral security needs without both China and resource-rich emerging markets. Australia has a lot of resources. Canada, the US, and Western countries, to be frank, are not in a position to be self-sufficient for our resources, for our security needs, given, again, the distribution of resources. I can't mine what I don't have. And remember, geology matters is that, we have manganese, but we haven't extracted it in the better part of 50 years because it's really low grade in the US and it's very expensive to extract. So from an ore grade cost point of view, we really do source it from abroad. So in many ways, for the first time, the West is engaging with emerging economies in a commercial way rather than just an aid way, which is what we've historically done. So minerals are taking countries that have long operated in the economic periphery and bringing them onto the main stage. So I'm writing a book. A book is a lot of work. I think my roots are a little bit grayer for it, but it really looks at three things. Who should we be partnering with? What mining jurisdictions should we be looking at? And what economic diplomacy instruments should we be leveraging? So I can break those three down quickly. Please. So first, let's think about who should we be partnering with? As I said, the US does not invest as the government by and large. We can create an enabling environment and find partners to work with. So I can't command the attention of the private sector. And the private sector has fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders. So commodity prices are quite low right now. Lithium prices, cobalt prices. Cobalt is a great example. We opened the only cobalt mine in the United States last year, and it was $40 a pound. Then it fell to 25, and then it fell to 15 by the end of the year. And at that point, it costs more than $15 a pound to get cobalt out of the ground. So in the same year, we opened and closed a cobalt mine, yet we're panicking about the DRC. And so the private sector, to be frank, is just hesitant. Drill results, initial resource announcements, financing, project development milestones are significantly lower now than they were 3 years ago. So basically, we need to partner with countries that do have capital to deploy. And in the current world order, that is not going to be China. So, I mean, I spend a lot of time with private equity firms, and I had this position before I met them, and it was certainly confirmed. Is the future of mining Chinese or is it American? And the answer is probably neither. The answer is it's Middle Eastern,
Right.
because they have the capital, they have the appetite, and importantly, they're trying to economically diversify. They don't want
Absolutely.
to be an oil company forever. So
Hmm.
when I look at it, Saudi Arabia is perhaps the most strategic ally. And remember that when Biden came in, it was quite a cold relationship with the Saudis. When he's towards the end of his first administration, it is a very warm relationship. So prior to the Hamas attack, we were already working on a normalization deal with
Hmm.
them to partner on $15 billion of critical minerals and support the development of 2 nuclear plants for them, which is a huge stride from where we started. And Saudi is less sensitive to short term price signals, and it's far more focused on long term strategic needs, which is quite similar to China, frankly. So while global mining exploration and activity has contracted, Saudi has massively scaled up investments. It now has the single biggest exploration program of any mining jurisdiction in the world. They have also taken an equity position in companies, so Vale Base Metals, which is a
Hmm.
Brazilian company, to source minerals for various downstream purposes. It's a new kid on the block, if you ask me, and they are moving fast in an effort to diversify their economy. And interestingly, their CEO, who's fantastic and a friend of ours, is an American West Point graduate.
Mm.
So that really shows kind of how that alliance is reforming. The second thing my book looks at is what mining jurisdictions should we be going to? And this is a product of two things. And geology is perhaps the most understated consideration. And I think the best way we can look at this is through Indonesia. So we really talk about Indonesia through nickel, but I like to say society's memory is very short term because the bauxite story is really important. So in 2009, the Indonesian government passed a law that required mining companies to kind of process resources domestically, and they gave them a 5 year timeline. The government's decision to do that was part of a wider effort to force Chinese aluminum companies to refine in Indonesia to get those value addition benefits, to generate jobs. But attracting foreign companies to do this became quite difficult. And the reason is they did not feel that Indonesia had high ore grade bauxite to remain a competitive supplier in the long term, which is really a necessary precondition to making these significant capital investments in processing. So, as the ban loomed, what Chinese operators did is they stockpiled bauxite and then they started exploring elsewhere. And the beneficiary was slightly maybe one that we wouldn't expect. They began supplying or, securing high quality bauxite from West Africa's Republic of Guinea.
Mm.
So even though the Indonesian government loosened that ban on bauxite exports in early 2017 to alleviate that pressure on local mining firms going, look, I'm unprofitable now. Indonesia actually didn't recover, and Guinea
Mm.
mining exports actually increased 79% year on year in 2017. And even in 2023, Guinea still produces 4 times as much bauxite as Indonesia. So geology really matters in a
Mm.
way that we often forget. The second thing you have to consider is political and economic risk. When I decide to build a mine, I'm usually looking at an asset that's, I don't know, 20 to 80 years.
Mm.
So if I was an investor, I want a level of confidence in the stability of a country and its policies. So I guess an easy example here where we see this went wrong was Zambia. It has significant geological potential, but in 2018, Zambia raised its royalty for the 10th time in 16 years. They began withholding our value added tax refunds, which is essentially sales tax. And they imposed double taxation, which means that if I'm importing copper from the DRC to process it in Zambia, when I'm imposing a 5%, And then when it gets exported, it gets taxed again. And it created an environment of uncertainty of tenure. So what happened? Production dropped despite good copper prices. The Chamber of Mines in 2019 said that companies withheld $650 million of investment. Vedanta's and Changa smelter ended. Glencore shut down its Mopati operation and went on to sell it. First Quantum was on the brink of retrenching 2,500 people because it was unprofitable with high taxes. They ultimately did not do it. But Zambia is also a relative success story. The new administration under President Hichilema cleaned that up. They scrapped the duties, restored credibility to licensing, cleaned up the fiscal framework. And what happened? I mean, First Quantum announced a $1.3 billion investment to build a nickel mine and scale up copper production. Anglo American began scaling up exploration. Rio Tinto did the same. And Barrick scaled up exploration to create a super pit that would extend its life by 60 years.
Yeah,
so ultimately, sorry, go ahead.
Just to sorry to interrupt. We had President Hichilema here at Panmure House last, I would say, May. He was here. And I remember just having a chat with him in front of we have a first edition copy of the Wealth of Nations. And, it was just interesting to hear him remark and kind of channel Adam Smith, if you like, right? In terms of, providing the sense of the last administration was corrupt and we're going to offer something different. We understand, pro-business, if you like, pro, let's, move forward. The finance minister was also here as well, very keen on getting investment and opening the country back up because it does have sufficient and significant potential. And I guess that would, I do want to come back to Africa, but I'll let you finish you didn't get the third point on your book, so sorry.
No, that's really interesting, right? Because Zambia was producing 800,000 tons of copper, and Hichilema said, I want this to go to 3 million by the end of the decade. And it's really important because, Zambia hit a debt crisis. They became the first country to default. And so Zambia quickly figured out that their way out of this debt crisis and getting, paying creditors, getting fiscal austerity, but importantly, generating revenue was going to be the copper sector. Over 70% of their foreign exchange is the copper sector.
And the sad thing about, when he gave remarks here as well, it was what I found so shocking was that the previous administration, and I think it was partly during COVID, basically stopped funding primary education. And so you had, basically, what we know about economic development historically is once you educate, primary education is so critical for moving any population forward. Thinking about Adam Smith's time in the 18th century, Scotland, this small country, went on to have this amazing enlightenment, and that was partly because it had a very educated population that could read and write. And the Scots went off and did amazing things because of that. So we know that education, and that the previous administration had cut funding to education, and this was something he promised to change. It's what's development if you're not educating the young and giving them the skills. So it was this isn't it's not just about revenue. It's about education. It's about the people that benefit from these resource revenues.
And I want to, absolutely. And I want to add one point. This is why Saudi is a very interesting ally to Africa. Saudi is in the top 20% in the world in terms of their Human Development Index, which is quality of education and education completion, it's health, it's life expectancy. And they did that actually in a very short amount of time from oil revenue. So when I look at countries in Africa, the kind of tale they want to hear is that their resources ultimately turned into equitable benefits, better education, better health, better standard of living. And Saudi did that so well. I don't think, most African countries are going to get Cristiano Ronaldo tomorrow,
no.
But there is that real need to finance development. And that's kind of music to their ears, is that how to leverage resources for ensuring that I'm not crippling a generation of kids who don't have the reading and math to actually become, enter the workforce adequately in 15 years.
Yeah, and I think, just looking at a close neighbor of Zambia, Botswana, I mean, they've done a pretty good job of mobilizing revenue and earmarking revenue from diamonds to education and healthcare. And, I've been to Gaborone once, and, it feels developed. And I mean, I know there are parts of the country that are, people are still less than modern, or not living in as nice a situation as in Gaborone, but you go there and you think, wow, this feels safe and clean, and you just get a sense that there's progress, and they've done that through a smart management of those resource revenues, but focusing them in particular on education, healthcare, and decent infrastructure.
You're the sovereign wealth fund expert.
Yeah.
But I mean, a lot of this has been, in a way, Botswana was long term that
Yeah.
like poster child of good governance, which we can come back to,
Yeah.
and setting up that wealth fund. I mean, you don't have to be Norway. Like you can do it as a developing country.
Yeah.
And if you do that, again, you finance long term human development gains, and that's a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, and if anything, the Norway model is actually not the best model to follow, because I always say that Norway was rich before it got rich. And so it basically emphasizes the long-term saving of these resources, whereas for developing countries, you want to kind of manage volatility, but you need to be investing in these economies, investing in your human capital potential, smartly, and adjusting for absorptive capacity of the economy to take revenues in any one time. But you can do it, and you can do it over, it doesn't take generations. I think what we've seen with examples like Botswana, or you mentioned Saudi, you can do this fairly quickly if you mobilize it, and you plan effectively, and you manage the resource such that it's not going to run out in 10 years, which has happened many times for natural resource revenues. But that, I think, gives us an opportunity to then, let's move to talking about what do critical minerals offer for Africa's economic development. Or did you have more to say on your book? I think, did we get to the third point?
Yeah, no, the third point is actually very basic, which is the West, which is how do we build our relationships with global South countries, right? And I mean, it kind of actually links to your next point of how do we use instruments to ensure that these countries are benefiting, but that we're really pulling them onto that economic main stage. So, I mean, a couple just, one is we need to strengthen the capacity of our embassies. I always say if you walk into a British embassy, you'll have a better experience of figuring out mining, because so many mining companies are headquartered in London. It's the backbone of the London Stock Exchange. So we need ambassadors who are supportive of minerals and mineral diplomacy. We've seen examples in Panama with the Cobra project that really a supportive U.S. ambassador would have been a game changer. I work with Australian firms and Canadian firms. They always say the U.S. ambassador carries more weight on public-private dialogue, supporting negotiations, dispute resolution. The second thing is we need to leverage our technical expertise. We talked about mapping. We have a fantastic geological survey. My dad is a geologist. He took a geology class, so I kind of grew up in the world of geologists in a way. Not that I am one, but that expertise should be leveraged abroad. Third, trade agreements. I want to make sure that emerging economies we can use trade agreements to ensure that they are benefiting from for example, the tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act. And in doing so, I incentivize firms to go mine and process in these countries. So new tax agreements. And then I think the final thing is, how do we make U.S. government financing better fit for purpose? Our Development Finance Corporation, as it stands, 63.2% of the world's lithium is unfinanceable with parameters of the project, because we can't support projects in Canada, for example, and another 10.4% requires a waiver. So essentially 75% I can't finance. So we need to think about, how do I make our institution better fit for purpose of mineral security? So it's really saying, okay, partners, the book is Partners. Where do we go and how do we execute that? And that's the heart of a cohesive strategy.
Okay, so just on the last point, it's interesting. So what are you saying for our institutions, the U.S. institutions that finance effectively international development? You would say that we have to, if we're going to focus on mineral security, that means investing in places like Canada as well. or non-developing countries, because that's where the resource is, and providing those concessional finance to support that.
So at risk of, I mean, I'm sure people disagree with me,
Yeah,
and I'm very
sure.
okay with that. Intellectual debate is healthy. So
That's
I
what
would
we want.
argue that in the next 3 years, that our DFC through our Build Act is up for reauthorization next year. In the next 3 years, I think we're going to have to open up our parameters and use that financing institution to meet our national security needs. But I mean, I think what we certainly need in the long term is that we need to create a separate financing vehicle. Because ultimately, if given the choice between financing a lithium project in Canada and financing roads in Togo, I am going to choose from a profitability point of view Canada. So you actually end up you do a disservice to your original mandate of development, right? So what you don't want to do is that trade-off. But creating a new institution, capitalizing it adequately, building the workforce I need for it is not something I can do in the next 6 months. So ideally in the short term, you widen parameters. And remember, mining is long-term. It can take me 5-10 years to get a mine up and running. And so in the next couple of years, you want to deploy that financing. And if that's our only agency, want to widen parameters. In the medium to long term, I want to set up an institution that is fit for purpose for our mineral security needs, because that financing is not a short-term need. I mean, we're going to need that for the next 30 years.
Right. And so moving on to the economic development bit, but before that, I want to go back to the issue of China. And you mentioned earlier that, well, we have a lot of we do a lot of due diligence, right? So we do a lot of environmental impact assessments. Some of the complaints when I've talked to officials in global South countries, they say, well, if we go to the Western institutions to get financing to build a new road, it's going to take 10 years and we're going to have to do all these things. Whereas if we go to the Chinese, they come and it's a package and they'll build it, they'll pay for it, everything's just boom, and it's done in 3 years. And when you're a government, and particularly if you're a democratic government and you have, or even if you're an authoritarian government, you still have clients, if you like, that you need to please, time matters. So they don't have 10 years to wait for the due diligence, even if it's better for the environment, better overall. They look at, well, we're going to go with the Chinese because it's 3 years, and they don't ask questions about our politics in the meantime. I mean, how do we get away from that? I mean, how do you overcome that? Because countries in the global South, they have agency, right? They are well aware of the parameters, and sometimes like, well, we'll go with the Chinese. How do we convince them otherwise?
So one of my favorite people, Adam, in Washington is the Tanzanian ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Elsie Kanza. And she's great because she's like, I just want to get the best deal for my resources. China, US, Australia, I want to get the best deal. So I'd say there's 3 points. The first is that the US does need to speed up. There's no way around it. We have historically lagged with our engagement on infrastructure abroad. And so streamlining due diligence, ensuring that capital is being deployed quickly is a heartbeat of that. Second, there is a greater aversion in my experience to working with China after we saw China seize Sri Lanka's infrastructure assets a couple of years ago. And again, with Zambia, this was a concern when they defaulted on their debt, and China, came out and they're like, look, we're not going to seize your assets. But there's a greater concern that if all of your key infrastructure assets have been done by one country, if things go south, then your assets can be seized. Or in the case of Angola, which is actually the biggest recipient of Chinese money, is that those loans that all came in the early 2000s after their civil war was Chinese money on resource-backed loans. So when oil was $130 a barrel, they were paying those loans off. But then it dropped to below $55 and they almost defaulted, and they went in, their economy contracted for 5 straight years. They still have about I think $18 billion in outstanding loans. It's actually very unsurprising that we have become very good allies with Angola as a result, because they are looking for partners that are not going to saddle them in debt, not going to be at risk of seizing their assets. So I think more African countries are actually seeing value in having diversified partners. So if I kind of combine those two factors of the US needing to move quicker, a lot of these emerging economies wanting a more diversified set of partners to protect themselves. And then the third thing would be where we really need to step up as an ex-World Bank person is our MDBs need to do better. This was Janet Yellen's point when Biden came into office. She was like, do better. You're not meeting public goods. And her advisor was like, the World Bank needs to stop having a fetish with its AAA rating.
Yes,
right? Like
I've heard that before. Yeah.
Yeah, meet needs. And I kind of, it's a funny statement, but it's true, is the World Bank needs to step up. So when you kind of consider those factors, you start to create a viable alternative to China. And one that's much more sustainable than, hey, China's going to build everything for me and I'm wholly reliant.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's not a question of really of competing against China. It's more of we just need to we need to be there, I guess, and be there in a smarter and more effective way, because China still requires resources. They still have firms that have expertise. They still have financing. So they're not going anywhere per se. And the governments in the region want additional partners so they don't have to rely solely on the Chinese, that they have alternatives, which, in a market, if you like, is good to have some choice. So I guess, do you see in relation to that, I mean, how much of this is, or what's the potential of this becoming a national security issue in the sense of we're fighting against the Chinese, or is it really just about, well, I'm not articulating this well. I think, from the Chinese perspective, their going out has basically been, look at how quickly we built China effectively in the last generation. We're going to go out and do this basically everywhere else. So we're not out there to kind of take over the world. We have a good experience. I mean, that's their development narrative that they like to, and I think part of it is genuine. I don't think it's completely, for nefarious purposes. But I guess my point is that how, the China hawks, do they need to kind of relax a bit? And you see what I mean? So it's not about competing against China. It's about, we need to be in the global South as effective partners alongside China, not necessarily against China.
Yeah, that's a great question, Adam. I mean, I always say that there's two things that are bipartisan in Washington, critical minerals, and then we're very uncomfortable with China, which might be a gentle understatement.
Yeah.
Look, I think there's two things. I mean, one big thing, which has actually come to India's benefit, is that the Chinese economy is nearly not as strong as we thought it was. At the start of 2022, JP Morgan came out and said, hey, we're at the start of a commodity super cycle. Prices are going to stay up for 10 years. A couple of reasons why that didn't pan out and prices started collapsing in 6 months. But one of them is that the Chinese economy did not rebound the way we hoped. Then we realized you have 20% youth unemployment, which is a really structural challenge. You had property developers going bankrupt one after another. And you had, everybody else was raising interest rates, and China cut them 3 times in a couple months last year, around the Q3, because they needed people to spend money. But again, structural Chinese problems. So this kind of too big to fail and having a limitless bucket of cash is really not, it's not reality anymore. And we're going to see growth rates come down long term, which is why you'll see a lot of alliances forming with India as being the biggest market in the world now and having, a relatively positive economic growth outlook. So that would be one, is that China is not necessarily going to have that cash. The second point would be, I mean, for the U.S., you're right. It is not, the economy of these developing countries is not going to fundamentally decouple from China. To be honest, one thing we always say at CSIS is that you're not even going to meet your net zero ambitions if you try to completely decouple from China, given their advantage in clean tech. But what the U.S. does need to do is just create a competitive alternative. Right. So a lot of that is soft power. We have some money. We have technical expertise. So it's thinking a little bit deeper, using soft power to ensure that we are making that progress. The biggest grief I hear, having been based in the region and working across Southern and Eastern Africa, because I have no French to survive in West Africa, is just that the US has not shown up.
Yeah.
Right. The French have shown up in a negative way. China's been very dominant for decades, but where is the US beyond PEPFAR and AGOA? So that's an area where we need to show up, and we're making strides. I think that's really important. But yeah, it's creating options for African countries as opposed to saying, hey, I need you to stop working with China and start working with the US, because that will not work. They need to maintain that sovereign autonomy.
So we just need to show up.
Yeah.
Effectively.
You need to show up.
Show up. And you're seeing that too with, on the China front, some of their state-owned enterprises, they're kind of having to pull back because they have been burnt on some of these loans and overextending themselves. So, I think China's had some learning going on where they realize that we can't just go out and, splash a bunch of money around because we might not get paid back. And I remember speaking to an American aid official that had worked in Africa for decades, and this was a problem that she was worried about, where she said, a lot of American companies that they still have institutional memory from being, burnt from investing in Africa in the 70s and 80s, and they still are reluctant to come back. And it's about getting over that hump that she was working on. This was a few years ago, but I think it's a positive story to say that it's not about competing with China, because it's so much of the China. We risk over kind of emphasizing the security elements, and it risks creating kind of tensions when we probably don't need to, and understanding. I had an interview previously on the podcast with Sir Paul Tucker, who makes the case that yes, we have different values, and that's fine. We need to understand what they want, and we understand what we want. We understand what our red lines are, and just we still need to work together. But moving on, and I think we'll finish on this, is the economic development potential, and how do we harness that, right? So we know a lot about natural resource revenue management. We know how to design and set up sovereign wealth funds. We understand, the institutions that can be designed. But avoiding the resource curse is really, really, really hard. For all kinds of reasons. There's just simple issues around governance and corruption, issues around, simply for Africa, is the lack of regional integration. People forget that it's like what you said with Zambia, and if you import from DRC to Zambia and you have to pay a tax, it's really hard to do business, let alone just travel from one country to the next. You talk to people that will travel; they have to fly to Europe to go to somewhere else in Africa. It's really that bad. And so I'm just curious how do we take this moment, right? If we're moving from big oil to big shovel for the energy transition, how can these resource-rich countries adequately harness that potential? What needs to be done?
So I want to make one point to link the last question to this question, which is really that what we should be advocating is not anti-China, but a global dispersion of processing and production. Mm-hmm. I don't think production and processing at 100% is healthy for one country to control, even in the United States. And the dispersion is very important, and that's where Africa really comes in. Now, the resource curse is the most age-old dilemma that we face, right? So it's a really tough question, but a very important one. And I am both bullish and bearish on this. I fail to believe life is binary at this point. Yeah. So the West can't and should not impose requirements on countries, or else we start to return to colonialism, which is certainly not conducive to advancing mineral security interests. We've seen this play out quite heavily in South Africa recently. The US said, no, you can't work with these countries. There was a House resolution that called on South Africa to leave naval exercises with Russia and China. It didn't stop there. It went on to say, and we call on you to rejoin ours. And that didn't go over well with South Africa. They're like, you can't tell us what to do, right? And so in a resource context, it's not that different. Where I would say is the US is kind of the sweet spot probably is, because we don't want to support a resource curse. And I don't want to support corruption and revenue going to a couple of elite, widening inequality, these types of things. So optimally, as a United States, we focus on countries with good governance and infrastructure. And in my optimal world, that creates incentives for other countries to do the same. So Namibia is an example that I love, and personally a no-brainer of where we should be actively working. They have Namibia and Botswana are the countries every year that are ranked as the best governance in Africa. They also have very strong trade ties with the United States. They are one of the prime beneficiaries of the AGOA unilateral trade preference program. And it's indicated through its utilization strategy that it wants to expand to new sectors. So when I think about mining, if we find a way to leverage more incentives there, something like AGOA actually becomes more mutually beneficial. But importantly, Namibia has what the World Economic Forum calls the best roads in Africa. There are companies investing in Walvis Bay, which is the port, and their rail needs some upgrading. They have rail, but it needs upgrading. But that's something that we should be able to support. But they have massive natural resources that we would benefit greatly from. They have a heavy rare earths operation that produces 2,000 tons of rare earth oxides and very high grade ones. You have significant copper reserves. It was the country's third largest export. You have uranium. And as a time when we are frantically trying to reduce our reliance on Russia and Kazakhstan. I mean, Namibia is I think the third biggest producer of uranium.
Right.
They also have zinc. They have fluorspar. They're the third biggest lithium producer. So I think when I look at countries like Namibia, it's like, okay, they have infrastructure, governance, resources. And what happens optimally, again, is that you can replicate this in other countries as they adopt good practices. But part of the reason we're a little bit averse in trying to get other countries to do our hard work in the DRC is because the governance is challenging. There's corruption around licensing. The infrastructure is weak. So I would say is you want to create kind of best case practices that ideally that we could replicate. And I'm quite hopeful that we are able to do that. Now, I will add that resource nationalism is a growing problem, and Namibia has rolled out an export ban. But the way I see it, again, a little bit of a hot take, is that a bad thing? Because right now, these resources are being exported in its entirety to China, and then they get export restricted. But if we actually build processing facilities in country, they can now sell them directly to the global marketplace, which benefits Western countries enormously. So I think it's actually maybe I'm a glass half full person, but I have a lot of reason to believe that we can actually turn these resource restrictions into a strategic benefit for us.
Right. Okay. Because they restrict something, but then that means they have to build the processing. And so there's a business opportunity there, right? So which leads to development. But just on, a place like Namibia, very large, small population. Same thing with Botswana, small population. What we need to be doing, though, is developing places like DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, masses of humanity that are, artisanal mining. I mean, you see these pictures of there, and I have a good friend that does ethnographic work, and he's Kenyan. He does work in DRC, and he's just like, oh, I don't go there. I'm not going to go there anymore. And he's in, and he's he can get around in a way, but it's how do we solve these big problems, right? Where we need to see the development, right? So you can imagine Namibia doing well. South Africa, we need another podcast to discuss,
Yes,
what's happening, what's going on with South Africa in terms of governance and the potential that it has or is missing out on, I would say. But it's, how do we then move places like DRC from, a place for a lot of people, it's really sad, the conditions that they live in, but there's so much potential. I mean, that's easy. That's I can see in Namibia being easier but how do we do the really hard ones?
So we need to separate out two things, right? Like I can't expect a company with fiduciary responsibilities to go straight into the DRC. There have been American companies that have been burned quite badly. So I can't force or incentive. I mean, I can create incentives, but I don't know that those incentives are going to be great. I'm going to the DRC next month, and I assure you there are plenty of people who are like, why? What are you doing, right? But this is where the government has a bigger role to play. And what people don't know is that the US actually makes a significant allocation into a security fund to provide national security support to the DRC. This security fund is about $1 billion. I think the DRC's GDP is like 8 billion. So it's huge.
That's huge.
Right? We do provide support to that. However, I think it's the US government coming in and saying, how do we support infrastructure? The DRC has the second highest amount of energy poverty in Africa. And so ultimately, it's like, should we be supporting energy infrastructure as a tool for soft power? Interesting idea. I think it's super important, to be honest. But ultimately, if the US government can go in and make some of these strides with energy, mining and processing are incredibly energy intensive, and it can be very expensive in a high risk jurisdiction. So I actually ultimately lower my cost of doing business and then hopefully de-risk private sector involvement. But it's a challenging jurisdiction. And the argument would be that it's maybe more of a development priority for the United States in the first instance than pushing companies to go in from a commercial point of view. Right. And I mean, look, people keep asking why, people aren't investing in cobalt. And it's actually less about the DRC and the way that technology is moving with battery chemistry. In 5 years, I mean, if the world has its way with R&D, we won't need any cobalt, or we'll need trace amounts of cobalt rather. So you're not going to go sink a 60-year asset somewhere when your demand forecast for cobalt's actually not super high. And so that's going to have a negative implication on a country like the DRC, and they really do need economic diversification, or those energy challenges are only going to deepen because your revenue is going to go down.
Okay, so one last question, switching gears a bit. You're in Washington, D.C. There's an election in November. I'm not going to ask you who you think is going to win, but what in your narrative would change if Biden continues or Trump wins?
So 49% of the world's population lives in a country with an election. So I'm really interested to see how the world with mineral security changes. But in the United States, I mean, look, Trump issued the first executive order on minerals in 2017. Biden did the second one. And to be honest, if you read the language of the executive orders, they're not fundamentally different. However, I think what you will see is that the framing around minerals changes. So with the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, we really see minerals as, being the electric vehicle supply chain, battery supply chain, renewable energy, clean tech. But with Trump, I mean, a lot of this is rooted in national and economic security. So I think if I were to order priorities for Biden, it would probably be energy, economic, national. I think you're going to have an inversion of that under Trump, national, economic, energy. But fundamentally, the priority won't change, but the semantics. And at CSIS, we're the #1 national security think tank in the world in the UN rankings. And I come from an energy security background. So I think we are able to balance that quite well, but we need to be ready for that reframing. And to advance our policy goals, we need to be ready to shift our language based on who wins in November.
Right. I think, it's interesting, and I just say this having lived in Europe for a long time, that most people, they think that there's significant change from one administration to the next. But actually, when you look at a lot of policies, there's a lot of consistency from Trump to Biden, from Obama, from Bush to Clinton. And you see these things, and the tone changes, and they'll use language, and with Trump, everything is a performance, right? So it's, he's going to take critical minerals and he's going to do something. And, it would be nicer if Biden was a bit more animated, but we won't go there. Maybe I'll cut this out. No, I won't cut this out. Well, you're off to write a book very shortly, and I hope to have you on again when the book is finished, because I'm actually curious to see if you change any of your expectations once you've gone out and, talked to the people that you want to talk to, a bit of time has gone by. So on that note, I hope to have you again on the podcast, Gracelin, in a couple of years' time, or when your book is out. Perhaps we'll launch it here at Panmure House. It would be fitting for us. And on that note, Gracelin, thank you so much for being on the podcast and hope to see you again. And good luck with the writing of the book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.